Here in Washington, along with Mike Barnacle in New York. Joining us on set, Republican Senator from Oklahoma, Senator Tom Coburn, who served in the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission 2 years ago, and the moderator of Meet the Press, David Gregory. Not bad. Not bad at all.
Where are we, Tom? Where are we, buddy?
I have no idea.
That's not good.
I'm not in the room. I'm trying to get home.
Yeah. Well, so you are, and you said it beforehand, and obviously for those that haven't watched, don't know, you and I obviously were part of the '94 class, very, very conservative, especially on fiscal issues. It's why you ran, why I ran. But you've been willing to get out of your comfort zone. You've been willing to say a lot of things that you don't like saying in order to save the country. When's the rest of Washington going to follow you?
Well, I think it needs leadership. I mean, look, what's the big problem? What's the big problem we have? We have $88 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities, and we have no idea how we're going to pay for them. And we have a fiscal cliff, which we describe now that everybody's talking about at the end of this year. That's not the cliff. The cliff is the unsustainable debt we have, and unless, in my estimation, a lot of economists, you're not going to put us on a path to prosperity unless you take about $9 trillion out over the next 10 years. And we're barely talking 4.
Nobody's talking 9.
Yeah, and 9's the only thing that actually solves us. So we're sitting here as a country. We have made commitments that have to be rearranged and made more efficient. We have a tax structure that is subpar of what we need for our economy in terms of our historical averages. And nobody's talking long run. Everybody's talking December 31st.
Well, I know. And you see John Boehner's proposal. I was very critical of the president's proposal. It's a non-starter. But John Boehner comes out talking about cutting $2.2 trillion. Well, you talk about $9 trillion needed over the next 10 years. Look at the past 4 years. We've almost added $5 trillion to the national debt. Over the next 4 years, we're going to add another $4 to $5 trillion. So we're going to add $10 trillion to the national debt over the president's 2 terms, and we're struggling to get $2-3 trillion in savings?
Yeah. And
the math doesn't add up.
You know, a lot of people worry about our debt to GDP ratio, and we compare it to all the rest of the world, and we say internal debt, we're at 65 or 70%. But that's not accurate, because the rest of the world takes their total government debt. We exclude all our state debt, all our municipal debt. If you compare us to the rest of the world, we're at 120% right now.
Okay.
So we're in trouble.
So I'm worried because he's worried. And you usually are the sort of, it make a lot of sense, and people usually turn to you as the guy that can bring people together or have at least a practical concept of what's going on, even if you have one point of view. David Gregory, what has changed since the election? What's different in this process? What do you see that maybe is a sign that there is a possibility here?
Well, I think that I don't think it's a great sign. I mean, I think the only thing that's changed since the election is that you have both Republicans in the White House who've decided to make this a completely outside game, take it directly to the people. And I think a lot of this discussion, Senator, about entitlements and overall spending is being overwhelmed by what we're still in the middle of, which is an ideological battle over taxes. And I feel like until that gets resolved in some way, we're not going to be able to get to some of the other pieces of this. I think the president could do more to confuse and confound Republicans if he were to say, I feel very strongly on the revenue questions on taxes, but we do have a spending problem. You know, Clinton took that approach in 1993, cut defense way back. I think the president could do a little bit more to attract some people over to his side if he did that. But I'm just struck by the fact that we've got this completely outside game. Right. There's not a lot going on the inside in terms of real negotiation, but we'll get there at the very end.
And Steve, there's a point we brought up last hour. You know, everybody is debating over raising top rates for people making $250,000 or more. You look, Tom's talking about $88 trillion. You look at the small percentage that these tax increases are as part of the bigger problem. And you realize that we're not even having a serious discussion right now. We're obsessed on something that's not going to save us.
Well, that's true. I mean, first, with respect to what David said, I think partly why they're playing an outside game is because they've been criticized in the past for playing too much of an inside game. The president's been criticized for not, criticized himself for not in the first term getting out more, taking his message outside, telling his story. Secondly, I do think the president has talked about spending. He has put entitlements on the table. It's sort of a crack in the door, if you will. But as you said, and I'd love to get the senator's view, it really comes down to this impasse over tax rates. The president has said they have to go up, but he's indicated they don't have to go up all the way to 39.6. But the Boehner letter said no increase in tax rates, period. Well, so how do we get off that dime?
Why don't we think about revenue instead of rates? What the fear of the fiscal conservatives are is, do you damage economic growth? Can you take $800 billion out of the revenue code in a way that's not as negative for capital formation as would be just rates? So my point, personally, I know we have to raise revenue. I don't really care which way we do it. Actually, I would rather see the rates go up than do it the other way, because it gives us greater chance to reform the tax code and broaden the base in the future. But to me, I think they're arguing over semantics. Is 800 billion is 800 billion?
Right. Well,
it's still going to be a negative drag on the economy.
To your point, Steve?
It's not quite semantics, though. It's not quite semantics in the sense that, first of all, the president doesn't think 800 is the right number. He says 1.6. The Republicans say 800. We can all imagine where the midpoint of that is. It's 1.2.
Mm-hmm. I don't think you're ever going to see that.
What do you think the maximum number is?
Look. We put forward in July of 2011, $9 trillion plan, had $1 trillion worth of tax increases in it, had $8 trillion of other savings, of which a significant portion was interest. And I can show, if people would sit down and look at it, all my colleagues say it's all in entitlements. It's not all entitlements. The government's twice the size it was 11 years ago. And a good portion of that's discretionary. The military, my colleagues have kind of a blind eye when it comes to the Defense Department. There's so much waste in the Defense Department. It's unbelievable. We could take another $50 billion, in my estimation, or $40 billion a year out of the Defense Department if we ran it right. We have 1,200 generals and flag officers now. At the end of World War II, we had 2,000. We had 12.5 million people under arms. We got 1.5 million. We got an admiral for almost every ship we have in the Navy right now. Yeah. I mean, we have nobody. We've had this creep in terms of ranks. There's all sorts of money to be saved in the Pentagon that will have no effect whatsoever on our defensive posture or our capability.
But Steve, I'm curious, though. What is the difference, in your opinion, between raising the top marginal rate and closing some loopholes and getting, if you get $1.2 trillion in revenue, why does it matter so much more to the president that you do it by raising the top rate when the super wealthy, as we've described on the show, aren't going to be paying higher taxes?
The issue is, Joe, it's a question of whether it's going to be 800 billion or 1.2 trillion or somewhere in between. If the number ends up being 1.2 trillion, and we'll see where it comes out, it's hard to do it just with deductions. You end up limiting deductions so much that you cut into charities, you cut into state and local governments, you cut into a whole bunch of home.
What about the Buffett proposal? The
Buffett proposal,
30% minimum tax rate for the wealthy.
Buffett proposal is a kind of no-brainer.
And how much money does that raise?
$160 billion over 10 years. Okay. So it's a piece of the puzzle. The reason I think they're so dug in rates is because I don't think they believe, honestly, that the math works to get to 1.2 trillion.
Well, I think they do believe that, but let's also talk about the reality of leadership, where it's working, where it's not. The president did campaign on raising rates, and he did that effectively, won the election. He can say, I ran on this. He's still running on that effectively. What he's not effectively, if he spent as much time on saying we have a spending problem and here's how we're going to attack it, explaining what that $1 trillion in spending caps are that were passed last year, nobody knows what's in that, as he does about my2K hashtag on Twitter, he might be able to, again, put more outside pressure on Republicans. I just don't think we're seeing that right now.
So, to your point, the president was criticized for passing on taxes on the rich in the past. I think it's a fair line in the sand to draw. But having said that, when you have Geithner going on Meet the Press and saying the Republicans are going to cave, ha, 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 and the Republicans releasing their plan to the press before they even go to the White House with it, it is totally an outside game. And this is impossible to get done as it is it not?
Well,
Tom Coburn, is it not impossible possible to sit down and actually do something responsible between now and the deadline?
It depends
let
on what your
alone
goals
fight
are.
it in the press.
Depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to politically dominate somebody.
Well, it sounds like on both sides the goals are not necessarily responsible if they're playing it this way.
I think there's a lot of people who have demonstrated that they're willing to, the only reason I'm still in Washington is the only reason I came back was to fix this problem. I ran on Pete Peterson's book, Running on Empty. I mean, that's what I ran my whole campaign on in 2004. I prophesied where we were going to be right now. And it's going to be worse than we think if we don't have grown-ups stop thinking about the politics and work out the best solution we can for the future of our country. What the president's offering now is essentially his budget. Got 0 Democrat votes in the House and the Senate, got 0 Republican votes. There are not a significant number of Democrat senators who will embrace $1.6 trillion worth of tax increases. I can just tell you that, of where it's going to come from. So when their bargaining position is their last budget,
which again get 0 votes.
Got no votes from one Democrat, and got in either the House or the Senate. There's a problem there. So what we're seeing is posturing. I think David's right. The dangerous thing that we're doing now is we're playing an outside game. I've really felt comfortable when we weren't hearing anything about what was going on, which means something's happening, and nobody's trying to manipulate the press to fill their position.
So is nothing happening? I mean, we asked you off the air how things were going, and you literally said
that's completely unexpected. By the way, I don't want to denigrate negotiating in the press.
Oh, yeah, you're all for it.
But I mean, I think we do have to go through this process of one public. I mean, we've got a little
It's
time.
more the tone.
We actually encourage negotiations in the press. It's really where the negotiations should take place. I'm curious, Tom, what you think of our good friend Jim DeMint, who we've known and served with for a long time. He said that the Republican plan put forth by John Boehner would, quote, destroy American jobs. Our Speaker Boehner's $800 billion tax hike will destroy American jobs and allow politicians in Washington to spend any more while not reducing our $16 trillion debt by a single penny. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's important to have the fiscal conservatives' viewpoint on this.
You're a fiscal conservative.
I know, but what I do is I look at the process and say, where are we today? What's possible?
But isn't it a lot easier to do what Jim DeMint did? And again, I love it, and that's what I did.
I think that actually helps Boehner in his negotiations. I think because he's drawn the line of stand for the fiscal conservatives, and it communicates to both the White House and the Boehner is here's how far you can go. The other side of that is the proposal that was offered to the president had all these signatures of all the leadership plus Paul Ryan coming back. So what Boehner's done is said, we're as a team, including Paul Ryan, suggesting this. But what you have is some firming up on the conservative side, which I think says Boehner, this is probably about as far as you can go.
Right, exactly. And so, since Joe said, so what is the outcome? What is you're a compromiser, you want to get a deal done. What do you think is possible here as a final package?
I think you could create what I would recommend doing is create a small package that shows the debt markets, not the American people, the debt markets, that we're serious about what we're going to do, that you put a drop-dead date on the tax code like July 31st of next year. You have to have reformed the code, gotten this money, and done it by then. Otherwise, there's no code, which means which is actually better in terms of really creating a more progressive tax code, which most of my friends on the left would like to see, and sitting down and talking about here's what has to happen in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Most people don't realize Part D, Social Security disability will be out of money in less than 2 years.
And
we'll be out of money in less than 2 years.
That's not
I'm sorry, Social Security?
Disability.
Okay.
All right, Mike Marnicle in New York has a question for you, Senator. Mike, go ahead.
Senator, I'm sitting here trying not to drown in pessimism over the prospects for our country. And I'm listening to you, and I heard you say just a few minutes ago that personally I'd rather see rates go up, which is unusual to hear from someone, in Washington. It seems to be, I'll meet you halfway, that sort of talk. So my question to you is, are we now at a point in the United States Senate or the House, the Congress in general, where ideology is so rigid on both sides, but specifically on the Republican side, where ideology is now so rigid that the larger concept of the country, of doing something for the country, now finishes in second place?
No, I don't think so at all, Mike. I think that's the wrong assessment. Do we have a revenue problem? Yeah, we do, historically. But it pales in comparison to the entitlement program we have. And so I would put that in the other side. You know, when we're saying we're not going to do anything about Medicare, and we're going to have 3.5 million people, including me, jump into Medicare this year, and we're saying, no, we don't need to do that. And if you look at our unfunded liabilities, we've frozen discretionary spending. Everybody agrees that the military spending is going to be declining. So if we do not address in a firm, cogent way, and we can still guarantee what we have promised, but maybe with some pain for everybody across the board, the very wealthy and also the not very wealthy, in terms of here's what has to happen. You know, we're losing perspective. It's neither taxes or entitlement, it's both. But the ratio has to be significant in terms of entitlements because the numbers don't work. I don't care what the politics are. Ultimately, the decision that will be made for our country is what the purchasers of our bonds decide what we need to do.
So what I don't understand, David Gregory, or anybody chime in, is that what the president is being firm on is tax rates on the very wealthy, which people like Steve Ratner and other CEOs have come forward and said, you know what, we can handle this. We just want certainty. We want to know exactly what it's going to look like, and it's not going to change our behavior. We're okay with that. That's not pain. So why can't, on the other side, the president and Republicans get together and figure out the painful part of this together? Well, I don't understand.
Well, they can if they're willing to and if they can survive the politics of it. I mean, I think the advantage that the president has now is not only has he campaigned on this question, but the truth is that the business community, which has not been with him, is essentially saying, look, we'll pay higher taxes.
We'll take it.
That's fine.
We'll take it.
But you've got to be committed to some kind of real deficit reduction. And that's where, beyond the spending, being serious about entitlements, there's got to at least be some framework that says, look, we are going to reduce the size and the scope of government. And that's finding that pain point on both sides so it's not a lopsided deal will at least give Republicans the room to argue, look, we can take this pain. We've won some concessions back, but we have to do this.
That should be done in private and together.
And again, though, the ratio between tax increases to spending cuts is a wide gap. I mean, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security together, taken with interest in the debt, that's consuming every dime that's coming into Washington, D.C. right now. People talk about, Democrats have talked about for a decade, the Bush tax cuts. They've driven up the national debt. Fine. Well, if that's the case, why is it that the president, as you said earlier, is embracing 98% of the Bush tax cuts?
Except that isn't true.
It's, of course, it's not true. The
size of the government, in terms of the Clintons' last budget, is more than twice of what it was in 2001.
Yeah,
right.
but look, the fact is the Bush tax cuts are $4 trillion over 10 years. If we didn't have the Bush tax cuts, we'd have $4 trillion less deficit over the next 10 years.
But everybody was against those until now they're not, because they only want the Bush tax cuts to be taken away from the actual job creators in this country. That's the problem.
A lot of nothing happening. Senator Tom Coburn, thank you so much. It's always good to have you on the show.
Good to be with you.
Good luck.